Wow, this is a kind of audience I don't usually come across. You know, people at the White House or in the military look a lot different than you guys. The energy here, it's pretty stunning. So, I want to talk about what's happening in Iraq and Syria, but more generally what's happening in the world today. And if I get to it at the end, because I tend to run off on tangents, why I think that the solution to all this is with young people, and how young people might be mobilized in ways that certainly isn't the case today. So this is what the front line with the Islamic State looked like for 2 years. About 3,000 miles of something that looked like it was out of the French Foreign Legion or some medieval battle plan. It stretched for 3,000 kilometers, and about every kilometer there was one of these little turrets with about 18 to 20 fighters there. And so I had my research team embedded in these turrets, which is about 800 meters from the ISIS lines. And we studied those fighters, and I'll tell you why we studied those fighters, as well as captured people from ISIS to the extent we could get hold of them. And I'm very much interested in what I call the spiritual dimension of human conflict. This particular set of research was motivated by a talk that President Obama gave in September 2014, where he endorsed the idea of his National Director of Intelligence, James Clapper, when he said, the greatest mistake the United States made was underestimating the will to fight among ISIL and overestimating that of the Iraqi army. And then he concluded, because like in Vietnam, will to fight is just imponderable. And so I brought my research team and myself to the front lines in order to show that no, will to fight is eminently ponderable if you don't rely just on cost-benefit analysis, on material incentives, on risks and rewards, but you look at what's in people's hearts and what motivates their commitment. And you'll see our group of researchers is very eclectic. We have the National Security Advisor at the White House. We had the Deputy Commander of the multinational forces in Iraq after Abu Ghraib. He was sent there to clean that up. We have what is maybe one of the best playwrights, coolest playwrights in the Arab and Kurdish world, the founder of the Cambridge Literary Review and a classical violinist. And we need all these people on our research team in order to figure out what people are doing and why they're doing it. So the question which really motivates me, I'm an anthropologist, I'm not a terrorism expert or anything like that. I look at things that are as different from me as possible in order to understand what it is to be human. And things like suicide bombing or mass murder or surviving for years alone in the Maya rainforest are the kinds of things, or playing beautiful music, because I have no talent whatsoever. Those are the things that I study with sort of analytic skills, both qualitative and quantitative. And the question I ask myself always is, how is it that human beings make their greatest sacrifices for ill or good, not for their own lives or family or gain, but for an idea? A transcendent moral conception of who I am and who we are. Now, when I was 10 years old, I painted on my bedroom wall, God exists, or if he doesn't, we're in trouble. It was 1962, October, the Cuban Missile Crisis. My father, a World War II veteran, just came home. President Kennedy had made a speech on TV, and the danger was very palpable. And I said, Dad, is there going to be a nuclear war? And he said, 20 to 30% chance, son, which I thought was great. You know, I was a little kid. He had just briefed the Pentagon that Phantom jets armed with Sparrow missiles couldn't knock down Soviet intermediate missiles. And then he was taken away to a deep facility in Pennsylvania for 3 days. And nothing more absurd ever seemed possible to me. At that time, there were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and with 90 minutes, the great majority of humanity could have been wiped out. Compared to that, or compared to almost all of human history, What ISIS represents, or Al-Qaeda represents, is that never in history have so few people with such feeble means caused such fear in so many. If you think about them, the Belgian army, the Danish army could defeat them if it was just a series of ordnance in a week or so. But yet, in everybody's mind, there was just a poll in India that asked what the greatest peril is for India. Not the Sino-Indian dispute, not poverty in India, but terrorism, Islamic terrorism. Of course, the media is the oxygen of all of this. And these guys play it jiu-jitsu style to make it real. And so it has become real in the conscience of our publics and our politics. And my job is to try to mitigate it. But here's the problem. In science, as in some parts of jurisprudence, in academia in general, if you're sincere, reason and evidence and logic are useful for inquiring into the truth and making discoveries about the world. But for most people, most of the time, and certainly in politics, reason and logic and empirical evidence have nothing to do with truth and discovery. They're used for persuasion and victory. So the almost impossible task of a scientist who's engaged in political conflicts is to try to use reason to leverage this unreason. And so that's what we try to do at the Center for Intractable Conflicts at Oxford. So let me begin with ISIS, what it is. You know, in linguistics, we say that the difference between a dialect and a language is whether you have an army or not. Well, the difference between a terror group and a revolution is whether you've won the battle or not. For the moment, ISIS is still considered a terrorist group, but in fact, it's a classic revolution, operating on classical revolutionary terms. If we think back to Maximilien Robespierre's speech before the National Convention in July 1794, where he introduced the modern concept of terror, saying that virtue without which terror without which virtue is evident, terror is only justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. For without a claim to moral virtue, it's almost impossible to want to kill masses of people innocent of any direct harm to others. When I hear things like ISIS is nihilistic or people are brainwashed, I think only of the willful ignorance of trying to understand where they're coming from. Brainwashing, of course, is a fiction of the Korean War, when 100 Brits and Americans didn't want to go back to Britain and America. So the idea of these social engineering Chinese geniuses using Pavlovian techniques to watch the brain was fictionalized in The Manchurian Candidate, and that's entered our popular lore. Or nihilism, the idea that people just want to destroy. It was part of the political philosophy of some groups, especially in Russia in the 1870s and 80s. But this is not the moral conception of ISIS. In fact, their argument is precisely the contrary, that our societies are nihilistic and morally corrupt, and their job is to reintroduce morals into the world. It's very similar in sense, in terms of revolutionary fervor, of the fact that it's a joyous movement of young people, to the National Socialist movement in the early days of the Third Reich. The Bible, or the tract in which every emir of the Islamic State is required to read, is called the Idarat al-Tawahush. Wahsh means animal, and it means the management of savagery or chaos in the world. There you can read, just like you can read in Mein Kampf, a plan carefully laid out about what they intend to do. And one of the things they say is, we will attack theaters and cafes and sports events and any place that is impossible to defend among our enemies. And the reason for doing this is twofold. First, In attacking indefensible soft targets, we undermine people's faith in the ability of their government to perform the primary responsibility of government, which is to secure the lives and property of their own citizens. Second, we will cause suspicion against all Muslims. And by doing that, we will show the Muslims in these diaspora lands that trying to live in peace only brings pain, and thus force them to join us. It's classic insurgent techniques. As I said, we went to the front lines with the Islamic State with the express purpose of scientifically probing the claim that President Obama made that will to fight is imponderable. And we used a theoretical framework, which I had developed working in other places in the world, called the devoted actor. Actually, it was something when a friend of mine, in a sort of drunken pub crawl, asked before I was supposed to brief the White House, well, you know, here's our paradigm, the rational actor, so what do you consider to be some alternate? He said, a devoted actor. A devoted actor is someone who believes in sacred values, in values non-negotiable, in things you could never trade off. Most of us would never trade our children, or our parents, or our brothers or sisters, or even our religions, and at least for some our countries, for all the money in China. And so the basic conditions of economic theory are violated when sacred values come into play. The other aspect that's very important to understand is fusion with the group. Many of you who live in communes, for example, you begin to bond with your group. But in our societies, most of us have multiple identities. I favor this sport team, or I'm part of this nation, or I have this academic job, or I have this job or vocation. But for people who are fused with one and only one group, that is their lives, and we can show empirically that they're willing to sacrifice for each and every member of that group. So how do we measure fusion? It's a very simple measure. Take a pair of overlapping circles. We put the flag or the icon of the particular group, and we ask, which of these pairs do you identify with? We do it on the iPad, where it's continuous, or we do it on just paper, where it's discrete. And the people who pick the last one think and behave everywhere differently from people who pick any of the others' alternatives. And we find that among ISIS or the PKK, both groups on the US list of terrorist organizations, very many pick the last. And we find that in Western Europe, very, very few pick the last. This is just to give you an indication of how we actually perform experiments in the field. They're not much like experiments in a classroom, which are mostly worthless. In psychology, over 95% of experiences over classrooms. This is during a lull after a chlorine gas attack. This is about 800 meters from the ISIS front lines, in a place between Mahmour and Qayyara, where we were in the first battle in the offensive to retake Mosul. And you'll see our cards with the little circles, and also bodies. And we do these interviews one by one. And we did dozens of them, of course, and we published them finally in scientific journals. But we, of course, controlled for them by doing the same experiments with thousands of people in other parts of the world. But the insights we got were from the front lines. Now, much more is known about economic decision-making than morally motivated decision-making. But here are some features of sacred values. First, they're immune to trade-offs that I've already discussed. You wouldn't trade a part of your kid for anything. Second, they're insensitive to temporal and spatial discounting. What does that mean? In economic and political theory, things that are closer to you in time and space are worth more to you than things that are further in time and space. So you discount the future or you discount the past. But with sacred values, often the opposite is the case. Things in distant past or distant future may be far more valuable to you than things in the here and now. And those are the things that really motivate commitments in human beings. They have privileged links to emotions. They generate actions completely independent of prospects of success. Suicide bombers almost don't care whether they blow themselves up or nobody else or 1,000 people. God will love you just the same. It's the act itself that's important. And they're blind to exit strategies. What does that mean? Well, the paradox of human existence is that large-scale societies beyond the family and tribe are based on completely irrational notions, and they have to be based on irrational notions. They're based on religious notions, for example. Take some religious proposition like God is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnipotent. Well, that's crazy. And when we do experiments with imams and priests and normal people, we say, for example, Johnny, he's in Wisconsin, his foot's caught under a rock, the water's rising, he prays to God to save him. At the exact same moment, Mary's in Australia, she falls down on the railroad tracks, she can't get up, she prays to God to save her. What does God do? No one says, wham, bam, thank you. They ask, does Johnny have any brothers or sisters? How fast is the train coming? Will their parents really suffer? Because it's literally inconceivable to understand propositions like that. And that's why we have priests and rabbis and imams who every week in sermons give you an interpretation of what that may mean in the here and now for today. And that's why religions are so adaptive. The same is true of secularized religions. Ever since the French Revolution, the isms, the political isms, have come down to earth. Anarchism, colonialism, fascism, communism, liberalism, capitalism, all of these are based on unverifiable notions that cannot be possibly logically disproved or verified or empirically disproved or verified. You have to believe them on faith. And when you believe things on faith and you make costly commitments, when you show you're willing to sacrifice, or you see someone else who's willing to sacrifice their lives for that, for pure commitment, for absurdity, that is the kind of thing that commands the greatest devotion among human beings. Now, we see all sorts of strange things. I mean, we work in Palestine, or we work in the United States. To give you Palestine, for example, we did a set of studies. We did it with the leaders of the Hamas, we did it with the leaders of the Israel, we did it with refugees, we did it with thousands of people, and we published this in journals like Science and Nature. And we asked them, excuse me, this thing jumps, has a mind of its own. We asked, for example, the refugees, would you be willing to give up the right of return in Israel for a permanent peace along the 1967 borders and tens of thousands of dollars, we changed it according to the experiment, in exchange for giving up the right of return? This after a poll by Khalil Shikaki, who works with us. His father was the founder of his brother was the founder of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, showed that only 6 to 8% of refugees would even consider ever coming back if they had the right. Yet well over 90% refused ever to give up that right, no matter what the reward was. We did the same with Israeli settlers in Gaza just 4 days before they were withdrawn. Would you give up the right to settle in Greater Israel, including these territories, in exchange for a permanent peace? No, no way. On the other hand, if the other side gave a symbolic gesture, if the Palestinians simply said, we accept the right of the Jewish people to be here in the Middle East, opposition even among the Hamas and the Palestinian Jihad to a permanent peace declined, for the Israelis declined precipitously. And when we said, and if the Israelis apologized for the dislocation and dispossession of the Palestinian people in 1948, just apologized, with no guarantee whatsoever of any material compensation, then opposition, even among the leaders of the Hamas, decline precipitously. And we actually did these experiments and published this in the most high-profile scientific journals. Now, we found in brain scans of supporters of the Al-Qaeda affiliate Lashkar-Taiba that willingness to fight and die for sacred values in the brain is processed very differently than you process utilitarian calculations of risk and reward and cost and benefit. We found that deliberative, calculated reasoning is inhibited and decreases, and rapid, duty-bound responses come to the fore when sacred values are in play. That is, they're almost like rules. We do it because we have to, and we do it now, and we, screw the consequences. Now, it's very interesting, brain scans, because it shows you that people can lie when they give verbal responses, but the brain can't lie. And so the brain scans show us that this isn't posturing. This isn't someone pretending. It also reveals striking things. For example, we find in the brain that the areas responsible for happiness and revenge are exactly the same areas. That revenge brings joy and happiness, which makes it a very, very powerful player that can't be ignored or dismissed with words when people say, oh, revenge will get you nowhere. Well, that's sort of nutty. What we show here is that sacred values and fusion with group, when a set of values become embedded in one of these groups I was talking about, then willingness to commit, to fight, to die, to torture, to kill, maximizes. And we did this in Europe, and we did this among people volunteering in North Africa for the Islamic State. We found the level of devotion much lower in Europe, but among those few who were willing to fight for democracy, the phenomena was the same. When they're with a group of comrades, when they believe in the value, when that value defines the group, then they're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. And we found another thing. We found that those who are willing most to sacrifice are those willing to sacrifice their families, which is one of the strongest commitments any human being has to their genetic kin. But if you think about the formation of all political groups beyond the tribe, they're all based on willingness, at least among some, to sacrifice family. Think of the monotheistic religions. Think of Abraham, waiting 70 years to have a son, and then willingly going out to slit the throat of his son for God's greater glory, until stopped by Gabriel. Or think of the very term Islam, which means submission of genetic and tribal affinities to God's greater message. And in fact, all political groups beyond the family and tribe require at least devotion, forsaking the family for that larger political idea. Now, in The Origin of the Species, Darwin had a very ego-bound notion of life. We struggle, we reproduce, we eat to reproduce. But in The Descent of Man, he had a problem. He was thinking about martyrdom and about heroism. And he says, why is it, even in lost causes, even when people know their whole tribe and family will die and be defeated, they can escape, and yet they will fight and die to the end? And then he says, if there are enough of such actors, and they can inspire others, then those tribes and groups willing to fight and die and give up everything in a lost cause will in fact win in the end in the spiraling competition for dominance and survival. And in fact, if you look at revolutionary and insurgent groups just since World War II, they have on average beaten police and armies with up to 10 times more firepower and manpower. Why? Because, again, police and armies rely on standard material incentives, pay, promotion, or disincentives like punishment, whereas these guys rely on commitment. And we also find a strange phenomena, but not so strange when you look at it. All these groups, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or all the groups of extremists since the anarchists of the 1870s, are founded by elites, well-educated, fairly well-off, often educated in science, engineering especially, and medicine. You'd be surprised how many insurgent groups are founded by people educated in medicine and engineering. Why? Because people educated in these things have operational, hands-on knowledge of the world, and yet are able to show delay of gratification in these long-term studies. It's only at a later stage that they begin bringing in masses of people from the margins, never founded with such masses of people. Poor people never initiate revolutions. There's overwhelming scientific evidence that that's the case. I won't go into the reasons now, maybe in the question and answer period. They always join revolutions at a later stage. That's exactly the same for ISIS. The third factor we found, remember the second was willingness to forsake your family, which is the measure of devotion. The third factor is what we called spiritual versus physical strength and formidability. Now, how did we do this? Well, we used Darwin's theory, and we said, look, when a big creature attacks a little creature, the little creatures that survive, the only ones that survive, they huff and puff themselves up and bare their teeth like this, and the big creature says, man, I'm not going to deal with that mother. I'm going to some other creature. And so we thought that those groups that are willing to resist were the ones that felt themselves physically strong and even perceived their enemies as physically weaker than they really were. Well, there had been evidence in classroom studies in the United States and Europe that that's the case. But in fact, when we went to ISIS guys and we went to PKK guys, which were the only ones who held the line against ISIS in their onslaught in August 2014, both of them, in almost the same gestures, threw the cards away and said to us, physical strength is meaningless. The only thing that's important is what's in your heart, which they called both in Kurdish and Arabic, ruhi bi'ayra. And so we developed a very simple measure on the iPad where the bodies got bigger and bigger and more muscular and muscular. But one frame was spiritual strength, one frame was physical strength. And we asked people to rate their own group and all the other groups, the Iranians, the Americans, the Sunnis, the Shia, the Peshmerga, the PKK, everybody and their brother, the Russians. And this is the typical response among all groups for how they rated ISIS and America. And I'll show you in the next slide, again, this is a ISIS guy. Now these ISIS guys, they actually volunteered to do this. One of the reasons is, of course, many of them thought they wouldn't be executed if they did this. But we promised them anonymity, and we promised them that they could stop the experiment at any time. And they were quite open. We had with us, as I said, General Doug Stone, who was the deputy commander of the multinational forces who took over the prison system in Iraq. He had interviewed 3,000 or 4,000 of these guys. And he told us that with these techniques, simple techniques, cartoon techniques, we were able to break through their psychological barriers in 20 minutes compared to months, if at all, with standard interrogation techniques, because there was no threat whatsoever to these people. And all of a sudden they were being treated like human beings and responded quite openly. Like when we asked them what it would take to stop the war here, it was basically get the fuck out of here. So they were completely honest about what they were telling us. And this is just to show you, this is just to show you, stop that. Bad. Come on. Well, I was going to show you here. This guy is a Peshmerga fighter. He's raiding ISIS. Okay? That's the physical force. Okay. And that's spiritual force. And you see, he takes note. This is the first time he's ever seen this. and it takes absolutely no time at all. Now, for the last 3 months we've been in Mosul, we've been talking to people who have just come out from under ISIS rule. Mostly in the IDP camps. They've been interned as being sympathetic to ISIS or being in ISIS families or being in areas that ISIS controlled. These are the camps. Sometimes the people in the camps can actually see their homes and villages nearby, but are not allowed out. And we ask them, how do they see the future? What's going to come down the line? How did they see ISIS? Well, first of all, almost everyone in Mosul and in the area embraced ISIS wholeheartedly when it came in. They called it al-Thawra, the revolution. It was only after 4 or 5 or 6 months when ISIS began executing police and army and any government official or people didn't go to rehabilitation Sharia courses that people started turning against them. Their leaders, they say, all of them, that the foreign fighters were the most devoted. They would walk without bodyguards in the street, but even go to sleep with their suicide belts on. And in fact, we very rarely saw captured foreign fighters in Iraq or Syria. Most would booby-trap their bodies before being caught. If they were caught, they were usually killed right away. After 3 hours of interrogation, the Kurds would basically say to them, "Oh, so you've come from China or Germany or Denmark to kill us? Fuck you." And that was the end of them. But for locals, they kept them alive because they wanted the Kurds and the Iraqis, because they want to have relations with the local tribes for the aftermath. And so there are actually trials and courts, and they present evidence. Most of the people, the overwhelming majority, believe still that Sharia is their sacred value. They don't believe that any of the forms of Western society work and only bring corruption and betrayal. And this includes democracy. No one believes in democracy. No one. And if you look at what democracy means, how it was introduced in the Middle East, you'll see that a vote without liberal institutions invariably brings only a tyranny of the majority. It took 200 years in Europe for democracy to develop through the development of liberal institutions. Napoleon introduced religious tolerance. Napoleon III and Bismarck introduced the notion of an opposition press, a legislative assembly, tolerance of minority opinions, imperfectly, to be sure. But suffrage, especially universal voting, was only the last stage after these institutions had been thoroughly vetted and accepted by the populace. When you introduce voting, direct democracy, in a society without such institutions, it can only lead to tyranny. And this is what these people experience, as they do all the other forms of Western politics that have been introduced in the region, fascism and communism and militarism and nationalism and all the other. So they're looking into their own roots. They're looking into their own history. And what ISIS is offering is that. They're offering the dream of the caliphate, which means as much to those people as the dream of Zion meant to Jews, even if they never had experienced Zion. It was an ultimate dream that ultimately became real. In fact, so many of the people compare that, even to their hated enemies, the Jews, that our dream is very similar. Now, the people in Mosul are divided into two groups. One who believe that ISIS was really out to screw, to divide the Sunni world, and was created by the Americans and the Iranians. Okay, about 70% of the people believe that's the case. The other 30% believe that ISIS really was true to their word and loyal and sincere, but that because of the pressure of Iran and the United States, they had to become brutal in exactly the same terms as Robespierre said they needed the terror to be introduced when the rest of the European countries began attacking the revolution. Well, these are just different measures, but let me try to give you a sense of what ISIS means for these people. It's a joyous and festive revolution. When I hear, I gave a talk to the UN Security Council, and I've given talks in the halls of government, and I'm always given this response, well, why can't people get along making a living? And why can't they accept that everybody's opinion should be tolerated? In fact, as my wife often says, my Fair Lady view of Mr. Higgins, why can't a woman be like man? The idea is, why can't they be just like us? Well, in fact, they don't want to be. They want to be who they are, and it's something we certainly don't understand and tend to pummel. Let me give you an idea of how it's recruiting, how people are recruited into ISIS. People often talk about social media and how important it is. And it's true, what's called the collective action problem, which means that people usually don't engage in movements because the personal cost to them is too great. They tend to do more engage if they know that other people out there are engaging. And so social media helps overcome that collective action problem. But only 1 in 5 ever get initiated into any of these groups, including ISIS, through social media. Almost all, 3 out of every 4 people who join ISIS, as for Al-Qaeda or far-right groups, do so through their friends and family, mostly through their friends. The greatest predictor of who joins is who your friends are. And we find that if it were social media, it would be a randomly distributed pattern of enlistment and recruitment. But it's concentrated in particular neighborhoods, in particular towns, in particular villages, in particular networks. Well, that makes a broader statement. What we find, for example, when ISIS started recruiting people, because they use social media a lot more than Al-Qaeda did, and they use personal recruiters a lot more, when they started telling people, come to Syria, and then we'll train you and you'll go back and you'll do bad things in Europe. They almost always failed. But when they plugged into pre-existing networks in neighborhoods, they were almost invariably successful. And these include Paris and Brussels and Barcelona, where we work a lot. When we trace the Paris and Brussels networks, the neighborhood networks go back to connections before 9/11, to the Paris attacks in 1995 and 96. In fact, one woman, Fatima Aberkan, and her family plugged into the Molenbeek network in Brussels, the mom of the neighborhood. Her brother is the one who gave the false passports to the journalists who blew up Ahmed Massoud in Afghanistan on September 9th that gave bin Laden the license to attack the United States. So these networks go back a long way in time, and they're rooted in local communities and families. This is Ripoll. It's a wonderful medieval town that I was just in 10 days ago, working with the people there. And what we find is El Sati, the imam, who planned the plot, it was to blow up the Sagrada Familia, but the bombs blew up, and so they used a van to kill the people on the Ramblas instead, and in Cambriels. He was pushing drugs, hashish, and then was put into prison with this guy, known as the Rabbit. This guy was the guy who arranged the hashish for dynamite exchange in the Madrid bombings, the worst terrorist attacks in the history of Europe. And they were in prison together for a couple of years. And when I looked into the mechanics of it, I found that the techniques, the way they organized, the community networks were almost the same as Madrid. So we find these things repeating again and again. And I'm stunned that our police forces and our politicians don't seem to learn much of anything. But people here talk about ideology, that this is a bad ideology, and we're supposed to counter it with narratives. Well, ideology, I think, is also a nonsense notion. Ideas do not exist in some space out there. They exist only in real people's minds, in particular places. You're listening to me. We have an environment here, this hall. The ideas I'm enunciating are interpreted by you. You're confined to the space, so you have to listen to me. You're already primed, because of the news media and your interests, to listen a little more closely than you would just random noise on the street. You try to understand. And these things are making these ideas, at least some of my ideas, to enter your minds. You think about them, and then you'll talk to your friends perhaps about them, and they may think about them, and eventually that will spread. If I was, of course, the King of Denmark or the President of the United States and the news media were here, they'd spread a lot faster. But it's fine for now. Well, the way ideas spread in the jihadi world or in the far-right world is exactly the same. You have particular environments. In Europe, you have a very strange set of environments. In France, for example, 7 to 8% of the population is Muslim. But 70% of the prison population is young Muslim males. It's like blacks in South Chicago. And petty criminals are not pathological criminals. They're not people who want to be criminals. They're people who usually fall into criminality, credit card frauds, stolen car parts, things like that, because of opportunity costs, because it's just hard to get into the mainstream, and because there are pre-existing networks which make it easy in the neighborhood. So ISIS comes along and says, you guys really don't want to be criminals. You would rather be heroes, of course. So why not use the skills that were forced upon you in this clandestine networks? Turn them against your oppressors. Free yourselves. Free your brothers and sisters. Free society. Well, that's a powerful message. And that's why you get such an involvement of petty criminal elements in Europe. In North Africa, it's very different. I got a call from the head of the medical school in Khartoum, calling me, asking me to explain to them why it is that their entire top A class went to Raqqa to set up a medical clinic. When we talked to the guys who came in June 2014 to Mosul and were able to download $400 million from the central bank on that Saturday, one of the Kurdish guys who was the manager of the bank asked him, so why are you doing this? And he said, well, he was an Algerian. I had a degree in computer engineering, but I wanted it to mean something in this world. ISIS will spend thousands of hours on one person, saying to a woman in Manchester or in Seattle or in Copenhagen, why is it that you see oppression all around the world and you do nothing? We know you love your mother and father. We know you love your brothers and sisters. But let us try to explain to you why there's something greater in life. Now, if you're a young Arab woman, the ones we interview at least, their parents are embarrassed to talk Arabic to them. They're viewed with suspicion by the people around them. And they also want red lines in their lives. Although, again, my wife says, why should we have red lines? But they want to know a woman is a woman and a man is a man, and they want to know when and where. And they say to us, there, we can find it. Although I also talk to young women who say the only reason they joined ISIS is because they gave them 1,000 likes on Facebook. So you get a whole range of people who join, which give you an idea of how vast it is. Now, how do you fight it? Well, up to now, it's been pretty abysmal. 9/11 cost between $400,000 and $500,000. Okay? Less than 500,000 euros, or about 500,000 euros. The United States alone has spent 5 trillion euros. Alone. That's 10 million to 1 advantage for the bad guys. And yet, we're no better off than we were before. In fact, arguably, the world is in a lot worse shape with respect to this than it was before. So obviously, we're doing something wrong. So what do you do to do it right? Well, I don't have the answer. But I can tell you this. If you look across the history of the world, of successful revolutions, of new ideas, it's young people who produce them. Sometimes old fogies do so, but basically it's young people. Now, after the World War, after the Second World War in the United States, you had a youth boom. It was perhaps the most creative period in the history of the world in terms of a production of ideas and material goods. But how is the world you look at youth today? It looks at it as a youth bulge, something to be clobbered, to be hammered as a threat. In fact, nowhere is there a program for empowerment of the youth who would be the most creative possible solution for this. Now, there are local success stories. In Pakistan, we have two teenage girls, 15 and 16, Saba and Gulalai Ismail in northwest Pakistan and Baluchistan. They developed a women's advocacy group by themselves, HIV education, against gender violence, and they brought in young Taliban because even young Taliban are interested in young women. And slowly they converted 100 of them, and those 100 then converted another 50 apiece. Now there are 10,000 former Taliban involved in these peace networks. And we find these local success stories all over the place. But the problem is there's no universal platform for them. And although we passed Resolution 2250 at the UN for youth, peace, and security, there's no funds for it, but even less so, there's no dynamic which lets it be realized. Let me give you an example. After we passed the resolution in 2015, there was a World Youth Forum in Jordan. People came from all over, young people, with brilliant solutions and also half-crazy solutions. And then there was a come-by movement. Everybody sang and then said, the governments of the world have to do this, and the governments of the world should stop doing this, and the governments of the world should do that. And I sat next to the Crown Prince, Atran, and I said, it's dead, isn't it? And he said, yeah, you should have seen what it was like before we talked to them. Because as Alan Brooke, Churchill's chief of staff, said about his boss, Winston, during the Second World War, Winston has 10 ideas a day, one of which may be good. And our job is to figure out which one that is. Well, these young people had 1,000 ideas. Maybe 100 would be good. But how were they going to figure out which ones were the good ones? Unless someone was there or people were there to telling them how power works. Even corrupt power. How do you navigate it? How do you move it? How do you change it like an aircraft carrier in a small port? Because that's what politics is all about. And unless you have a platform to do that, where young people can exchange ideas and figure out how to move these things, it will go nowhere. And I should start ending, but let me tell you what I think my bottom line in all of this is. Civilizations rise and fall on the basis of cultural ideas and ideals, not on material assets alone. People are willing to make their greatest devotions for values they hold sacred, like the fighters of ISIS and like some who fight against them, like the PKK and increasingly like the Peshmerga. We find no comparable willingness among young people in the West to do the same for their values. We do find among militant groups and the environmental group or the LGBT group, they're willing to sacrifice. But on the whole, in our general populations, we find very, very low levels of willingness to sacrifice anything. And one of my favorite articles is a one-page summary of Mein Kampf, book review by George Orwell in 1940. And Orwell asks, how is it that socialism, and to a more grudging extent capitalism, offer their citizens avoidance of risk, ease from pain, health, hygiene, birth control, in short, the good life. And our citizens, our best and brightest, in this case, the Oxford Student Union, vow never to fight again for those values of democracy. And Mr. Hitler, what is he offering his people? Glory, revolution, destruction, death, and 80 million people fall at his feet. Why? Asks Orwell. Because Mr. Hitler has understood something very profound about human nature. Human beings need, at least intermittently, a sense of transcendence, a sense of self-sacrifice, a sense of purpose and community of why they're here on earth, other than simply to pass the time. And Mr. Hitler is offering that. Now, the Third Reich was defeated not because of devotion on our part. Despite the Hollywood propaganda The German soldiers outfought the Allies in every major campaign. The general tendency for a military unit to go to entropy, to destruct, is with 33% to 35% casualty or destructive infrastructure destruction. That's how the Israelis fought the Six-Day War. They would verify that there was at least 1/3 destruction and then move on to the next target without even looking twice. But the Waffen-SS and other groups of the German army who had grown up together in the Hitler Youth were willing to take 50, 60, 70% casualties and fight to the death even when surrounded in places like Budapest by the Soviet army. They were defeated because the Americans were able to build 20-to-1 advantage in ordnance. The Germans lost 8 million. The Americans lost 350,000 people. But they had 20 times the firepower at the end of the war. And the Russians, they just threw people at them. 22 million people died. And so they were overwhelmed. And ISIS will be overwhelmed. But ISIS poses a problem that the Third Reich didn't. They have no infrastructure. What's going to happen now? Because ISIS is only the symptom of something even deeper. And what is that symptom? Well, I was at Davos in January, and I was listening to Xi Jinping, the president of China, make his great speech in which he said basically, look, I'm the only grown-up left in the world. Look at what's happened to the United States and Britain. They've all gone crazy. And then you have these nutty nationalists walking up all over the place. The Chinese people and the Communist Party, in their wisdom, have accepted globalization. And these are only blips in the inevitable progress which you should let China lead. Madame Lagarde, the head of the IMF, and Senator Kerry, it was the day before he was no longer to be the Secretary of State, basically made the same point of view, but from their point of view. It was Europe that was going to do it, or was the United States was going to do it? And then the rich who rule the world. I mean, I was at one meeting in which the average wealth was $20 to $30 billion a person. That's $1 million a year for 20,000 years for each of those people. And what was their solution? Their solution was that they were going to give a little part of their money to all the poor people on the earth. And that was going to stop all of this nonsense. And I was there telling them, look, the scientific evidence is overwhelming that poor people don't initiate revolutions. Not only that, it's worse than you think. Because if you give people basic subsistence without a purpose, without something to commit to, those are the people who become revolutionaries. So, if you want to destroy yourselves, do exactly what you plan on doing. With the defeat of fascism and communism, and by the way, I see the far right playing off the jihadi movement, much the way the fascists and the communists did in the 1920s and 1930s, for much of the same reasons. If you look at Europe between 1815, the Congress of Vienna, right after the bloodletting of the Napoleonic Wars, up to World War I, you see that the elites of Europe came up with a quasi-institutional consensus which kept the power structure pretty much intact. There was the Crimean War and there were local wars. And Britain intervened successfully to stop Russia and the Ottoman Empire from disintegrating and kept more or less the balance of power. But then beginning in the 1870s, things began to rapidly unwind. The anarchist movement burst out, in which the people no longer accepted the domination of their elites because the creative destruction of mercantile and capitalist economies was leaving them in the lurch. It was destroying their family and traditional structures. They had nothing to fall back on, and they were becoming proletariat or lumpens across the world, especially in Europe with industrialization. And so the anarchist movement arose very similar to the Al-Qaeda movement in the world at large. In 1870, beginning in the 1870s, there was the assassination of the Tsar, the killing of the Empress of Austria, the killing of the President of the United States, the killing of the President of Spain, the killing of the King of Italy. Dozens of bombs in cafes and theaters and spectacles across Europe and the United States. It was only stopped when the Bolshevik movement killed it, because they were even more intelligent. They had a territorial base. They had a more ruthless approach. And so ISIS did to Al-Qaeda very much what the Bolsheviks did to the anarchists. The improbable victory of the United States stopped all of this in World War II for a period of time. But now the problems that agitated Europe have now come to agitate the entire world. The nation-state system, which even Russia and China accept, now dominates the world. Capitalism, despite however you call it, in China communism, now dominates the world. And so you have a constant creative destruction. But there's nothing to fall back on. Millennial communities, communities that have been around for 1,000 years, have disappeared. The plurality of the world's languages are now in just New Guinea. It's the only place left. And so with people with nothing to fall back on, are prey in the environment, just like you are here, to these contagious ideologies. Well, I wanted to give you that last slide, and then I'm finished. I just wanted to show you that last slide, which to me represents exactly where we are. There you go. This is a photo I took a few months ago at the Freedom Tower in New York, where the Twin Towers were destroyed and the new tower is built. And there was this advertisement, which I thought was quite indicative and ironic of our state of the world today. It's a guy lying on a bed with dollar bills surrounded, commit to something. This is an advertisement for an equity franchise. On the other side is ISIS, the willingness to sacrifice. And so I ask you all, as people who can really be players in this world, believe it or not, where would you go? My own students who dialogue with ISIS, mostly PhDs, smart and intelligent, often from the Muslim world, but from all over the place, from every kind of discipline, ask me after a year of dialoguing with these guys, geez, I wish I could feel that kind of passion. What do I have? It is that, and that alone, will be able to parry the advantages of the far right and of ISIS. So the greatest threat to our societies doesn't come from violent and extremist views. The existential threat to our societies comes from the vitality of our own values. To what extent do we believe our values are worth fighting for, are worth committing to, are worth sacrificing for? And that's a question for each and every one of you to answer for yourselves. Thank you.